listeners. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us in this next session of our webinar series. I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Cameron Klein. He's one of our WSA executive consultants. And Cameron joined WSA as an executive consultant back in 2019. Previously, Dr. Klein worked as a manager in the people analytics group at PwC, and before that, worked with many of us as a senior managing consultant with IBM Connexa. He's really been a trusted business partner for our clients over the years, and that have included some of the largest hospitality and retail organizations in the world, as well as global finance, technology, healthcare, and many manufacturing organizations as well. We're pleased to welcome Cameron, who will offer his expertise today on this very intriguing subject. So, Cameron, with that, over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, James. And I am really excited to share this data. It's really a timely topic here as we think about return to office, and especially over the last couple of years, a lot of organizations bringing folks back to the workplace. So excited to share with you some of the insights we've gathered over the last 3 years and a little bit longer in some cases, as we look at that demographic that we often get in these experience programs and the data files around work arrangement status. And so as we jump into it here, just want to take just a minute to set the context. I don't have to remind anybody on this call about how COVID disrupted the world of work in a way that really none of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. There's always change going on at work, but that was certainly a much bigger disruption than we normally see. And all of a sudden, if you were, pretty much an organization where you needed people to be on site, retail or manufacturing or some other industries, healthcare, leaders immediately, as quickly as possible, figured out how to be experts in PPE and those sorts of things to keep people safe. But on the other side, a lot of people were sent home to work remotely, and that lasted for a couple of years, and people kind of got used to that. And so at one point, really, I would say probably picked up steam in 23, 24, where we had the pendulum sort of swung back and people were called back into the office. And for some folks, they had gotten used to organizing their lives around being able to work from home. So those return to office mandates did leave a lot of folks frustrated, both, we can see that in some of our data, but also anecdotally and also reading other articles and things that have been out there. So what we're also seeing is an interesting sort of swing back where maybe some of the organizations that were really aggressive in bringing folks back have maybe figured out how to shift back a little bit to more of a hybrid schedule. And that's reflected a little bit in some of our data as well. The bottom line with this is we look at some of the areas where we have higher scores or lower scores, depending on whether you work in the office or whether you're hybrid or remote. The bottom line is to get the strategy right for your organization. So what's best for you and your organization may be different than another organization when it comes to your work arrangement and your return to office approach. And one really want to spend our time going through some of the findings and indicating areas where you might see some advantages or disadvantages depending on where you're asking folks to work from. So our data set, many of you are familiar with it. We have a 3-year rolling average. And so this includes all of 2023, 2024, and nearly all of 2025. That is over the 3-year average, nearly 900 projects, over 550 companies, and you can see the volume of actual survey responses there. So really large database, but the challenge with the research that I'm sharing now is that not all of those companies have a work arrangement demographic. Those that are 100% on site and always were probably don't have that demographic, and others just didn't have it in their HRIS feeds. So don't always have that information for every project. But when we looked at our data more closely, again, using that same 3-year database that we had some criteria we had to apply to do this research. And the number one thing was, did they include a work arrangement demographic? That typically would include whether employees were on site, whether they were hybrid or completely remote. That looked a little bit different from one company to the next, as you can imagine. So we had to make some additional decisions in terms of what to group together and what made more sense from an analysis perspective. One of those decisions is we had to have at least 75% of the folks in the data file have a work arrangement demographic. So if we were looking at a project and no matter how big the company was, if they only had 50, 60% of their folks tied to that work demographic information, we did not include them in the research you're about to see. So again, had to have that information for at least 75% of their employees. We did decide to end up focusing on North America. The vast majority of our once we narrowed down with the first two criteria, the vast majority of the data we had left from a work arrangement perspective was from US and Canada. we also know that there are cultural differences around the world and how people respond to these surveys. And so North America tends to score sort of middle of the pack. There are other countries and regions that score much higher or much lower. And so from a cultural perspective, we also limited it to North America focus here for this. And then finally, the other big decision we made was to combine the hybrid and remote to compare against the on-site. A couple of reasons for this. One, and probably the most important reason, is that we weren't really seeing big differences in scores between the hybrid and remote populations in terms of how they were tagged and what they were feeling good about or where they felt there were opportunities from a sentiment perspective. So we combined those. The other reason we combined them is just for practicality purposes. Once we combined hybrid and remote, we had about the same volume of data as we did for the on-site population. So that kind of gave us a pretty level or pretty even two different comparison groups to look at when we're doing these analysis. So the final data set, so we went from 800 plus projects over that 3 year span that we have in our overall database to about a quarter of that, which I think is pretty good for the moment, at least in terms of over 207 projects. So again, about 25% of our overall database had the right criteria to be part of this study. And we would certainly encourage going forward if you have different work arrangement statuses but do not have that demographic on your survey, we would encourage you to include it because there's a lot of neat things you can do within your own organization in terms of analyzing that data that can be very informative. What I'm going to share here is more across organizations, but again, if you're in that boat where you have different work arrangements and you don't have that included in your data file, I would encourage you to put that in there next time around. Okay, so let's jump into it. I wanted to describe the data that we're working with here. When we looked in and sorting the remaining data that we had, again, over 200 different projects over a 3 year span, we did sort these into our major industries that we track and have sort of labeled some of these near the top. Not surprisingly, some of the what we call high on-site industries. These all had 82% or more of their folks that were recorded as on-site with a much smaller percentage of remote and hybrid. Retail, construction, healthcare. Again, not very surprising. There were a few in the middle that were closer to a 50-50 split. And so for some of the analyses we're looking at, we sort of separated those out and did not include those in some of the comparisons between the high and low on-site industries. And then low on-site, which conversely would be high remote or high percentage of hybrid folks. And you can see those on here. The information industry, professional, scientific, and technical services, and then finance and insurance, all of these having looks like 64% or higher that were either remote or hybrid organizations or employees within those organizations. So this is sort of how we split it. We certainly have additional data on a few other industries, but not as much as we had for these larger ones that we're seeing here. So the overall, one of the things that we were caught up with early on, or that jumped out to us really, is what we're calling this pendulum effect, where, and this is just looking at proportions right now. We're not yet getting into some of the scores that we'll share here in just a minute, but in terms of proportions in the database, we found that by 2024, it was essentially peak of the on-site work. Most folks that were calling people back to the office had done so by then, a majority, I would say. And so we saw upwards to about 60% on site within the year of 2024. So this is again looking at each year separately. That retreated a little bit in 2025, and we think that's a little bit of a recalibration that was done. Maybe organizations that were aggressive in bringing folks back decided again that they could get by with more folks being hybrid, and certainly that has some advantages when it comes to employee well-being and experience, as we'll see here on some of these later slides. So a little bit of a pullback in 2025, where again the assumption here is that folks were moving a little bit more to the hybrid situation after pretty aggressively calling folks back somewhere between, and not shown here, but from 21 to 24 as people were really called back into their office environments. Taking a quick look, still looking at proportions here, but then if you remember a couple of slides ago, we looked at some of those high on-site industries, so retail, construction, and healthcare, and then looking within those industries specifically, what percentage of their folks were on-site, hybrid, or remote. And so for the high on-site industries, now if you look at the blue line here, the proportion of remote and hybrid has increased from a 2024 low. So in 24, when you look at those high on-site industries, the proportion of remote and hybrid was less than 20%. That's bounced back a little bit to 28%. But again, as we're purposely segmenting high and low on-site industries, we're certain to see a difference here, and that's what we see. But the on-site employees have decreased a little bit in 2025 for these high on-site industries. And so that was a little bit of a trend we saw. We didn't see the same pattern with the low on-site industries. So information, finance and insurance, those sorts of industries where the majority of folks are remote and hybrid, as you can see here, ranging really not a lot of variability. So ranging from about 70%, a little bit lower now to 67% within these industries, with a slight uptick when it comes to on-site populations for, again, these low on-site industries, or stated differently, the high proportion of remote and hybrid. So a little bit of fluctuation here. I think more so with the high on-site industries where they've moved a little bit more to the remote and hybrid side in 2025 versus 2024. Now, getting into the fun stuff with the data and the results, let's look at engagement. And here we do have a little bit of a longer term trend across going back to 2020. Of course, the pandemic year of 2020, engagement scores hit an all-time high, in this case, 81% for remote and hybrid, 78% for on-site. So pretty high for both populations. That has trickled down a little bit over the years. You can see how it's trickled down to current levels. -4 points on the remote and hybrid. We're down to 77%. And the on-site went from 78 at the peak to 70% today. A couple of things that are interesting about this is that they're tracking pretty closely up until more recently. So in 2024 and 2025, the two populations have further split such that remote and hybrid engagement is now 7 points higher than on-site engagement. You can see when we started looking at this in 2020, there was only a 3 point difference. Very high scores across the subsequent years, about a 3, 4, 5 point difference, and now a 7 point difference when it comes to engagement. So it appears from our data, from again over 200 projects over this, well, the 200s over the last 3 years, but going back further, we're seeing a clear advantage for engagement when it comes to remote and hybrid populations. We also track leadership effectiveness. Now, this one has been a little bit closer in terms of any differences between the two groups. And in contrast to what we saw with engagement, we did not see a peak on leadership effectiveness scores in 2020. Actually, those are some of the lower scores. I guess we're kind of back to that level now with the on-site population, but really didn't see a big difference between on-site and remote when it came to aspects of leadership effectiveness. That has widened just a little bit in the last couple of cycles, where we now see a 5 point gap between the on-site and the remote or hybrid populations. So leadership effectiveness, 5 point difference favoring the remote and hybrid. The engagement difference is a 7 point gap that's favoring the remote and hybrid. But we wanted to ask across the rest of the items that we commonly use, approximately 150 additional survey items in our database, where were we seeing some of the biggest differences between on-site and hybrid, or remote and hybrid, beyond engagement, beyond leadership effectiveness. So want to cover a couple of items here that were certainly clearly favoring the remote and hybrid, and then we'll turn the tables and show a couple items that tended to have a preference for the on-site experience. So this one's not surprising. This is probably the least surprising result in this entire deck and in our analyses here. People that work in remote and hybrid settings tend to have a better feeling about work-life balance. Again, not surprising. Here we have a 12 point gap and a 10 point gap, respectively, on items around the ability to balance my work and personal responsibilities and having the flexibility I need in my work schedule. So again, least surprising result of what we found, but certainly folks that are remote and hybrid feel better about their work-life balance possibilities. Working conditions, another one probably could have been expected in most cases. The question here was the safety and physical working conditions are good where I work. Here we have an 11 point advantage for the remote and hybrid population. This one was kind of interesting. It sort of raises the question, who is that other 10% that don't feel like they have good working conditions working remotely at home? And I guess for some folks, if they don't have a good printer, or if maybe they don't have a great coffee machine like they were used to, or bad lighting, or just noise or other interruptions at home, I could see maybe that's part of it. But generally speaking, the remote and hybrid tended to score more strongly when it came to the working conditions than those who are on site. Another area, and this one was a little bit more of a surprise here, around alignment to performance expectations. So we had a question. I understand how my performance is evaluated. The remote and hybrid population were 11 points higher. So far, these differences that I've been sharing are statistically significant differences. So when it comes to work processes, when it comes to work-life balance, also the performance expectations. We are seeing higher scores for the remote and hybrid, and these are statistically significant differences. To me, this one has a little bit to do with the need for, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but when you are working remotely, there needs to be a level of trust between those who are working remotely and their immediate leader or immediate manager, such that you have a trust in those folks to get the job done, and you may be having more explicit performance conversations because you're not running into each other every day at the coffee machine, but when you are checking in, you're really checking in on performance and making sure people have what they need. So that could be part of it. Maybe just a little bit closer alignment with immediate leaders, which is, I think, required, but not necessarily natural when you're working in a remote setting. And the last area that was showing us significantly favoring the remote and hybrid populations was being treated fairly by my immediate supervisor or manager. This one maybe a little bit of a surprise, I guess. The theory here might be that if you're able to work remotely and you're given permission to, and you're trusted to, you may feel like that uh, you have a higher level of respect from your immediate leader. So that's possibly why that's showing a 10-point gap here, but certainly another area where the remote and hybrid are scoring significantly higher than the on-site population. So those stood out again in addition to engagement, in addition to manager effectiveness, several areas that showed strength for remote and hybrid populations. Now, there were also a few areas that showed higher scores for on-site populations. These, importantly, over the next couple of pages, did not reach statistical significance. So I would characterize these as sort of directional, but certainly not definitive. But we did see slight advantages here for customer service type questions. So customer problems are dealt with quickly, and we regularly use customer feedback to improve processes. So anytime you have to collaborate to solve customer issues, to use customer feedback to make improvements, to escalate service issues, the presumption is that if you're in a face-to-face setting, you're maybe more effective at doing those, especially problem resolution type of situations. So again, a slight preference here where the on-site employees scored a bit higher than the remote and hybrid, but did not reach statistical significance. The next area around work processes, this was the biggest gap, a 6-point gap where on-site workers felt better about the whether the work processes are efficient and well organized. This one was close, but didn't quite reach statistical significance, and but was again the biggest difference we saw that was favoring the on-site worker. So when it comes to work processes, being efficient, being organized, certainly some benefit for the on-site population from what it appears. And then innovation. This is one that's been talked about quite a bit in the popular press in terms of, the type of work that really needs to be done face to face or that would benefit from being face to face. Things like customer problem resolution, teamwork and collaboration, and then also innovation. Easier to innovate, get more creative solutions when you are face to face. We've seen a lot of that in the popular press, and I tend to agree with that in most cases where when you're getting people face to face and sort of brainstorming together, you can come up with more innovative solutions many times. And so that's what we're seeing here. Again, directional. There's a 3-point uh, gap here favoring the remote and hybrid here versus the on-site. And actually, sorry, this is favoring the on-site, not the remote and hybrid. I think these labels got switched around here. So to be clear, 78% should be for the on-site, 75% for the remote and hybrid here. So a couple of areas that are favoring the on-site populations, but not strong enough or not a big enough gap, at least with the 200 plus projects we have to reach statistical significance. But we did see some advantages for customer service, processes, and innovation. But the predominance of our findings really supported the idea that remote and hybrid folks feel better about several areas, including engagement, leadership effectiveness, work-life balance, working conditions, alignment to performance, and fair treatment by managers. So, on balance, certainly more advantages for that remote and hybrid population based on the data that we have in this particular study. And just to close here, and we want to leave some time for questions here at the end, but just to close quickly with 5 high-level recommendations for leaders. And the first one is the ability to answer a key question. So this question is, what work arrangements will enable employees to do their best work, serve their customers effectively, and build an organization that attracts and retains exceptional talent. So I referenced this earlier in terms of being cognizant of the work arrangements that are necessary for one particular company may not be the right solution for a different company. So making sure that you understand, hey, the purpose of our work, what we're trying to achieve, we can do our best work. We're going to set up our work arrangement to serve that purpose. Invest in the physical workspace experience, especially if you have a higher proportion of folks that are on site and or you're bringing people back to work in the office that have been working remotely. So examples of that, an example of what not to do, for example, is bringing people back from a remote situation where they're sat in a cubicle and they're on a headset all day and they're on calls, they're not interacting with people. That's not a good physical workspace experience, and most people will probably end up resenting that if they feel like that's work that they could have done remotely, and there's no real reason to be them back together. So again, if you're collaborating, if you're innovating, those are great purposes to bring people together. In addition, I would think about things like break areas, break rooms, common areas, seeing depending on where you're located. But if you're in a big city, helping people out with parking, making sure that there's ample security as people are walking into the office from wherever they're parking at. Things like that are important when you're bringing people back that have been used to working from home. They don't want to come into a dangerous situation. They don't want to come into a situation where it's going to be uh, much more expensive for them to commute every day, to park every day, things like that. So keep those things in mind if you are in a situation where you're bringing folks back into the office. Building trust through economy. Through autonomy. The best managers and supervisors are going to have a close relationship with their direct reports. They're going to understand, who has sort of earned the ability to work remotely. And it's something that we also talk about where oftentimes, at least initially, folks that are sort of allowed to work remotely are the ones that have proven themselves that they can produce and perform over multiple years. Sometimes there's a bit of a trial period where you work remotely for the first time and we want to see how it's going. It may not be permanent, but generally speaking, when you can build up that trust and have that close connection with your immediate leader, they trust you to get the work done as needed. And when employees feel empowered and trusted, that's going to have positive benefits when it comes to productivity and engagement. The fourth recommendation is supporting well-being across arrangements. So I touched on this a bit earlier, but we saw where we had comparative advantages for on-site versus remote and hybrid workers on various aspects of the experience. Making sure that regardless of where folks are working, that you are supporting their well-being, whether that's physical workspace, whether that's technology, whether that's finding ways to make sure that remote people feel socialized and included, and not left out of things. So regardless of work arrangement, making sure that you're supporting folks' well-being wherever they're at. And then finally, some thought to rethinking performance management and career development. Some of the research that's come out touches on a couple of things here where oftentimes managers will say, well, I don't, if I don't see that person all day, I don't know that they're doing their work. I don't trust that they're performing and doing what they're supposed to do. Shifting the mindset there from a focus on sort of hours spent, in a particular location to outcomes and deliverables is a better way to approach performance measurement, especially for distributed or remote teams. And also, there's some literature now coming out around proximity bias when it comes to promotions and development, where remote hybrid employees tend to have some disadvantages sometimes when it comes to getting the visibility, maybe building relationships with top leaders, where it will impact their promotion and development opportunities. So it's important to, again, create deliberate structures, mentorship programs, visibility systems where people that, regardless of where they work, would have equal chances for promotion and development type opportunities. So thank you for joining. I want to wrap up with a couple of pieces here, but we've covered some of the research here when it comes to relative advantages for remote and hybrid workers. This is part three of our State of the Workforce series of webinars. The original paper can be downloaded if you scan this QR code, and also on our website, workforcescience.com. And also want to encourage you, we have additional webinars coming up this soon. We're going to be doing several more this year, including a big one early in the fall in September in partnership with SHRM. So those will soon be posted, and you'll be able to sign up for those shortly. In the meantime, make sure you're following us on LinkedIn, and happy to stick around for any questions we have. James, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, a couple questions actually, Cameron. Going back to the breakout of industries in terms of on-site versus hybrid remote. One question around, where would the utilities industry fall under those? And I'm not sure that we had enough to even record that, but I'm not sure if you had that available in that visual there.
I don't have it all available. You're right, that had a lot less data in that particular industry. Depending on the type of jobs within industries or within utilities, I should say, some of those folks are going to be more in the on-site, I would imagine, more so than maybe other industries, but didn't have a ton of data on that work arrangement demographic for that industry.
Cool. Thanks, Cameron. Second question. I'm sure engagement is higher in more professional roles and lower in non-professional roles. I'm also assuming there's more professional roles in hybrid, at home, kind of remote situations and vice versa. Have you taken this into account in the numbers as you kind of dived in?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really, I think a focus of some of our upcoming research that we'll be doing going forward. We want to collect more data. The more data we can get on work demographics and work arrangement demographics, the better we'll be able to sort differences that are maybe also tied to industry and or level or type of role. Uh, you know, yes, we do see some differences across industries when it comes to engagement, and some of those. Finance and insurance is a good example compared to manufacturing. The engagement norm, the score difference between those two industries is about 3 or 4 points between those two. But that wouldn't account for the full 7 point difference we were seeing on the two populations we were looking at. So I do think that's a factor, both industry and sort of kind of level within the organization or type of roles. Those are also important factors that we just need further study, and we're going to need a little bit more data to really separate some of those things.
Perfect. Well, I think we have time for one more. Have you studied the impact on engagement based on the number of days required in the office, whether that's 1, 2, 3, 4 days, etc.?
Yeah, another excellent question, and that raises something in our criteria for combining the remote and hybrid. We recognize obviously that the hybrid could look very different from one organization to the next, and we didn't have that in the data files. We would have to have gone back with all 200 companies and had conversations about what does hybrid mean for you. And then often when you talk to them, they would say, well, for this segment of our population, it's 3 days a week. For this segment, it might be two or one. So very, very good question. A little challenging to separate just because we would need, I'm guessing 3 or 4 times as much data, which we're collecting. We will get there, but it's a great question and just don't have a full answer to that right now.
Thanks, Cameron. Can appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for attending this session. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. But again, as Cameron said, feel free to sign up for those upcoming webinars and download our State of the Workforce paper. Thanks all.